I never imagined that the person who shared my room as a child, who taught me to ride a bike, and who swore to always be by my side, would be the same person who would try to destroy the only thing that truly mattered in my life. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 38 years old, a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon, and this is the story of how my own brother almost ended my 12-year marriage. What he didn't know is that I'm no longer that naive boy who blindly believed in blood ties. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I promise this story will show that sometimes revenge isn't about hate, but about justice. It all started 6 months ago, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was in the office reviewing plans for a bridge project when my cell phone vibrated. It was my wife, Jennifer, married for 12 years, 2 beautiful children, a comfortable house in a quiet suburb of Portland. Perfect life, right? Wrong. Her message was simple, but laden with a tension I couldn't understand at that moment. It simply said that we needed to talk when I got home, and that it was about my brother Marcus. My stomach churned. Marcus had always been the troubled son of the family, the one who never managed to hold down a job for more than a year, who always had a ready excuse for his failures. But he was my brother, and I always believed that deep down he had a good heart. When I got home that night, I found Jennifer sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open in front of her. Her eyes were red, and I could see she had been crying. My heart started racing. She turned the computer screen toward me without saying a word. What I saw left me completely paralyzed. They were screenshots of conversations, dozens of them, between Marcus and various women on dating apps. But these weren't his conversations. They were conversations using my photos, my name, my profession. My brother had created fake profiles impersonating me on at least 5 different apps. Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, even that damned Facebook dating. He was pretending to be me, setting up dates, sending suggestive messages, promising relationships to unsuspecting women. Jennifer showed me more. She had received a message from a woman named Ashley, who said she had gone out with me 3 times in the last month. Ashley had photos, screenshots of conversations, even selfies that we supposedly took together. Of course, it wasn't me in the photos with her, but from a distance, with a cap and sunglasses, Marcus could pass for me. We look alike, same height, same build, brown hair. The difference is in the details. His more angular face, the scar he has on his eyebrow. But in blurry photos, or from a distance, the resemblance was enough to fool people. Ashley wasn't the only one. Jennifer had managed to track down at least 7 other women who thought they had met me. Some of them had even gone to motels, believing they were having an affair with a married man who promised to leave his wife. I felt my world crumble, not because of the possibility of losing Jennifer, because deep down I knew she knew me well enough to know that wasn't me, but because of the betrayal. My own brother, the person I trusted most in my life, was actively trying to destroy my marriage. And it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was months of planning, of elaborate lies, of calculated manipulation. Jennifer told me she had discovered everything because one of the women, smarter than the others, had done a reverse image search and found my real LinkedIn profile. She then contacted Jennifer directly through Facebook, confused and wanting answers. That's how everything came to light. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the bedroom ceiling, Jennifer asleep beside me after hours of talking, assuring me she knew I had nothing to do with it. But the question hammering in my head was simply why? Why would Marcus do this? We never had a serious fight. I always helped him when he needed it. I lent him money that I never saw back, gave him job references, let him live in my basement for 6 months when he lost his apartment. I was the older brother who always tried to guide him, protect him, and this was his way of thanking me, trying to make my wife believe I was a traitor, a liar, an adulterer. The following morning, Friday, I called the office and said I was sick. I needed time to process everything and decide what to do. Jennifer went to work after making me promise I wouldn't do anything impulsive. She's a corporate lawyer, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always considering the legal consequences. I promised, but inside I was already seething. I spent the entire morning scouring the fake profiles Jennifer had found. I read every conversation, every lie Marcus told using my name. He told women I was unhappy in my marriage, that my wife didn't understand me, that I was looking for someone who truly valued me. Classic lies of a womanizer, but using my identity, my reputation. What shocked me most was the coldness with which he did everything. These weren't improvised or careless messages. Marcus had created a complete narrative, an elaborate story about my life that mixed truth with fiction. He knew details about my work because I always shared them with him during family dinners. He knew about my hobbies, about the places Jennifer and I frequented. And he used all of this to make the lies more convincing. One of the women had even mentioned that I, or rather, Marcus, pretending to be me, had spoken about my daughter Emma's 15th birthday, which was in 2 months. He was using my family, my children, as material for his lies. Around noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called Marcus. He answered on the 3rd ring with his usual casual voice, as if nothing had happened. He asked how I was, made a joke about the Blazers game the night before. I took a deep breath and asked if he could come over to my house, that we needed to talk about something important. I felt a pause on the other end of the line, an almost imperceptible hesitation, but then he agreed, said he'd be there in an hour. I hung up and sat in the living room, trying to control the anger that grew inside me with each passing minute. When Marcus arrived, he had that easy smile he always had, that relaxed posture of someone who has nothing to hide. He was wearing jeans and a Seahawks t-shirt, his hair messy as always. He came in and asked if I had any beer in the fridge. His normalcy, the total lack of guilt or nervousness, made me even angrier. I told him to sit on the couch. I grabbed my laptop and opened it in front of him, showing him the fake profiles, the conversations, the photos. I watched as the blood drained from his face, as that confident smile disappeared and gave way to an expression of panic. Marcus tried to deny it at first. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, that it must be some kind of hacker or someone using their image to cause trouble, but I was prepared. I showed him the IP address that Jennifer had managed to trace with the help of a tech friend of hers. The messages had been sent from our mother's house, where Marcus had been living for the past few weeks. I also showed him the geolocation of the meetings he had arranged, all in places less than 5 miles from her house. Marcus couldn't deny it anymore. He lowered his head, ran his hands over his face, and finally admitted it. He said yes, it was him, but that he had an explanation. The explanation he gave was even worse than I imagined. Marcus told me in a trembling voice but with a hint of resentment that shocked me, that he had always lived in my shadow. That I was the perfect son, the successful one, the beautiful house, the happy family, while he was the failure, the one who never achieved anything in life. He said he wanted me to feel how he felt, small, inadequate, a loser. He wanted me to lose something important, just as he felt he had lost the respect of his family, of women, of everyone around him. Marcus said it wasn't anything personal against Jennifer or the children, but that he needed to bring me down a little, make me suffer, so that I would finally understand what it was like to be in his place. I remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking. Part of me wanted to punch that face that looked so much like mine. But another part, the part Jennifer had trained over the years of marriage, knew that violence wouldn't solve anything. So I told Marcus to get out of my house. I told him he had 72 hours to delete all the profiles, to send messages to each of those women explaining the truth and apologizing, and that if he didn't, I would go to the police and file a lawsuit for identity theft, defamation, and harassment. Marcus tried to argue, said we were siblings, that family didn't do that to family. I just pointed to the door. He left, and when the door closed behind him, I knew this was far from over. That night, when Jennifer got home from work, I told her about the confrontation. She hugged me and said she was proud of me for not losing control, but I saw in her eyes the same thing I was feeling. Marcus's betrayal wasn't just about fake profiles or lies on the internet. It was about breaking the most fundamental trust there is, the trust of blood, of family. And as I hugged my wife that night, an idea began to form in my head. Did Marcus want to make me feel small? Did he want to bring me down? Well, he was about to find out he'd chosen the wrong person for that. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to make sure he never tried something like that with anyone else again. And what I had in mind was going to leave him in tears. The next 3 days were the most tense of my life. Marcus did what I asked, deleting the profiles and sending generic apologies to the women, but I knew that wasn't enough. He had done it because he was afraid of the legal consequences, not because he truly understood the gravity of what he had done. Jennifer and I spent that weekend discussing what to do next. She, ever the pragmatic lawyer, suggested that perhaps it would be best to simply cut off contact with Marcus and move on, but I couldn't. The anger still burned inside me, mixed with a disappointment so profound it felt like a hole in my chest. My brother had tried to destroy my life out of pure envy, and he needed to learn a lesson he would never forget. On Monday, while I was in the office trying to concentrate on a presentation for an important client, my phone rang. It was my mother, Patricia. She was 82 years old, widowed for 7 years, and Marcus lived with her, supposedly to help her with household chores. My mother had always been protective of Marcus, always making excuses for his failures, always treating him as if he were an eternal victim of circumstances. But when she started talking, I realized this time was different. She was crying. She said that Marcus had arrived home on Saturday completely distraught, locked himself in his room, and didn't want to talk to her. When she finally managed to get him to open the door, he told a distorted version of the story, saying that I had accused him of terrible things without proof, that I was trying to distance him from the family out of jealousy of his relationship with her. I felt bile rising in my throat. Of course, Marcus had lied to our mother. He always did this, always played the victim, always manipulated the narrative to seem like the misunderstood poor thing. But this time, I wasn't going to let it go. I took a deep breath and told my mother that we needed to meet in person, the 3 of us, and that I had proof of everything I was saying. She hesitated. I could hear in her voice that typical reluctance of a mother who doesn't want to believe that her son has done something truly terrible. But eventually she agreed. We arranged to meet Wednesday night at her house after dinner. I hung up the phone and realized my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from a determination I had never felt before. That night I talked to Jennifer about the meeting. She sat me down at the kitchen table, poured 2 glasses of red wine, and looked at me with that serious expression she wore when she was about to say something important. Jennifer knew me better than anyone, and she knew I was planning something more than just showing the evidence to my mother. She took my hand and said she would support me in whatever decision I made, but she made me promise one thing, that I wouldn't become the person Marcus was, that my revenge, if that's what I was planning, wouldn't turn me into someone who used lies and manipulation, that I would remain Daniel Carter, the upright man she had married 12 years ago. I promised, and at that moment I truly believed I could. The next 2 days dragged on like an eternity. I couldn't concentrate on work. My mind kept returning to what had happened and what I was about to do. I started researching. I researched identity theft, the legal consequences, similar cases that had gone to court. Jennifer helped me, using her contacts in the legal world to understand exactly what my options were. And the more I discovered, The more I realized Marcus had gotten himself into something far more serious than he had imagined. Identity theft was a federal crime. The women he had deceived could sue him for emotional fraud. If any of them had given him money thinking it was me, that was wire fraud. Marcus was facing the possibility of years in prison if things were taken to the extreme. But prison wasn't what I wanted for my brother. As furious as I was, as betrayed as I felt, I didn't want to see him behind bars. It would destroy our mother. It would affect my children who still saw Marcus as the cool uncle who brought gifts and told jokes. No, I wanted something different. I wanted Marcus to experience firsthand what it was like to have his life turned upside down. I wanted him to experience public humiliation, loss of trust, the feeling that everything was crumbling around him. And then, on Tuesday night, while I was showering before bed, the complete idea finally formed in my head. It was perfect, it was cruel, and it was exactly what Marcus deserved. On Wednesday, I left work early. I stopped by the laptop to pick up all the evidence, organized into a presentation Jennifer had helped me put together. It wasn't just randomly thrown together screenshots of conversations. It was a complete document, with a timeline, IP analysis, and statements from the women Jennifer had obtained through carefully crafted messages explaining the situation. It was a closed, irrefutable case, impossible to deny. I kissed Jennifer and the children before leaving. Emma, my 14-year-old daughter, sensed something was wrong. She had that sharp teenage intuition that always felt when there was tension in the air. She asked me if Uncle Marcus was okay. I forced a smile and said everything would be resolved soon. My mother's house was in Gresham, a suburb east of Portland, on a quiet street lined with old but well-kept houses. When I arrived at 7 o'clock in the evening, it was already getting dark. The living room lights were on, and I could see my mother pacing back and forth through the window, that nervous gait she always had when she was anxious. I took 3 deep breaths before getting out of the car. I carried my laptop under my arm and rang the doorbell. My mother opened the door almost immediately. Her eyes were swollen, her grey hair disheveled. She hugged me without saying anything, and I smelled the familiar scent of lavender she always wore. For a moment, I almost gave up. But then I saw Marcus sitting on the sofa behind her, and all my determination returned. Marcus looked terrible. He hadn't shaved, had deep dark circles under his eyes, and was wearing the same clothes he'd worn the last time I'd seen him. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and defiance, like a cornered animal unsure whether to flee or attack. My mother made us sit down, Marcus on the sofa, me in the armchair facing him, her in the chair between us as if she were a mediator. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Finally, my mother said we needed to talk as a family, that we needed to resolve this because she couldn't continue like this, seeing her 2 sons fighting. I nodded and opened the laptop. I placed it on the coffee table, rotated the screen so she could see, and pressed play. What followed was one of the most difficult scenes of my life. I spent 45 minutes showing my mother, point by point, everything Marcus had done. I showed her the fake profiles with my photos. I read aloud some of the most explicit messages he had sent to women using my name. I showed her the photos he had taken with them, wearing caps and sunglasses to hide their faces. I presented the IP analysis that proved everything was done from her house. And finally, I showed her the statements from 3 of the women Jennifer had found, where they detailed the encounters, the promises Marcus had made, the money some had lent thinking they were helping a married man in financial difficulties. One of them had lent $1,200, another $800. I watched my mother's face as it all unfolded. I saw the initial disbelief give way to confusion, then shock, and finally something that felt like physical pain. Her hands trembled, She looked at Marcus repeatedly as if expecting him to jump up and shout that it was all a lie, a setup, a misunderstanding. But Marcus just sat there, head down, shoulders slumped. When I finished, silence returned to the room. It was a different kind of silence now, heavy not with tension, but with overwhelming sadness. My mother finally spoke, her voice weak, almost a whisper. She asked Marcus if it was all true. He didn't answer. She asked again, louder this time, with a touch of desperation. And then Marcus nodded. What happened next was devastating to watch. My mother began to cry, not that quiet, restrained crying, but deep sobs that shook her whole body. She asked why. She asked how he could do that to his own brother, to his own family. Marcus tried to give the same explanation he had given me about feeling inadequate, about living in my shadow. But this time the words sounded hollow, pathetic. My mother interrupted him mid-sentence and said something that completely surprised me. She said she knew she had failed him, that perhaps she had been too protective, that perhaps she had made him a man who didn't know how to deal with his own flaws. But that didn't justify what he had done, that trying to destroy his own brother's marriage out of envy was unforgivable. I could have left it at that. I could have accepted Marcus's tears, my mother's disappointment, and considered that justice enough. But I didn't, because at that moment, watching Marcus cry on the sofa, a part of me still wanted more. I wanted him to feel the same despair I had felt when I found out what he had done. I wanted him to understand that actions have consequences. So I took a deep breath and said I had one more thing to show. I picked up my phone and opened a folder I had prepared. It was a compilation of posts I had found on Marcus' social media over the past few years. Posts where he complained about his job, where he made racist and sexist comments thinking he was being funny, where he mocked people with financial difficulties while he himself couldn't pay his own bills. I told Marcus and my mother that I had spent the last few days thinking hard about what to do, that I had two options before me. The first was to go to the police, file a formal complaint for identity theft, and let justice take its course. This would likely result in Marcus having a criminal record, difficulty finding jobs in the future, perhaps even some prison time depending on how the prosecutor decided to handle the case. The second option, I said slowly, was to take justice into my own hands. Marcus raised his head for the first time in minutes, his red eyes staring at me with a mixture of fear and curiosity. My mother also looked at me, waiting. And that's when I finally revealed my plan. The plan that would make Marcus experience a fraction of what he had tried to do to me. I told him I wasn't going to the police, but that Marcus was going to do three things. First, he was going to personally contact each of the women he had deceived and return all the money he had borrowed, even if it meant selling everything of value he owned. Second, he was going to make a public post on his social media, explaining exactly what he had done, without omitting details, without playing the victim, taking full responsibility. And third, he was going to seek professional help. A therapist, because clearly there was something deeply wrong with someone capable of doing what he did. Marcus began to protest, saying that this was going to ruin his life, that no one would want to talk to him anymore, that he was going to lose the few friends he still had. I looked him straight in the eyes and said that perhaps this was exactly what he needed to feel in order to finally grow up and become a real man. My mother remained silent for a long moment. I expected her to defend Marcus, to say I was being too harsh, too cruel. But to my surprise, she agreed with me. She said Marcus needed to accept the consequences of his actions, that she wasn't going to protect him from himself anymore, and that if he didn't do what I was asking, she herself would go to the police with me. Marcus looked at her, shocked, betrayed. But my mother just looked away, tears still streaming down her face. It was at that moment that I saw something break inside my brother. He was no longer the arrogant, apologetic man I had confronted days before. He was someone who was finally understanding that he had gone too far, that he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And when he nodded, accepting my conditions, I knew my revenge was only beginning. I left my mother's house that night with conflicting feelings. On one hand, there was a sense of victory, of having finally cornered Marcus and forced him to face the consequences of his actions. On the other, there was a strange emptiness, a sadness I hadn't expected to feel. In the car, before starting the engine, I sat in the dark for a few minutes, just looking at the house through the rearview mirror. I could see the silhouettes of my mother and Marcus in the living room window, two figures that seemed so small and broken. Part of me wanted to go back there and say that everything was all right, that we could find another solution. But then I remembered the messages he had sent using my name, the women he had deceived, the cold and calculated way he had planned everything, and the compassion evaporated. When I got home, Jennifer was waiting awake in the living room, still dressed in the suit she'd worn to the office. Only her high heels had been swapped for slippers. She stood up as soon as she saw me come in, her eyes searching mine, trying to read how the confrontation had gone. I told her everything, every detail, every tear, every word that had been said. Jennifer listened in silence, nodding occasionally, her hand holding mine. When I finished, she sighed deeply and asked me how I was feeling. I told her the truth, that I didn't know. That part of me felt I'd done the right thing, but another part wondered if I'd gone too far. Jennifer pulled me into a hug and said something that kept hammering in my head for the rest of the night. She said that justice and revenge were two different things, and that I needed to be sure which one I was seeking. In the following days, Marcus fulfilled the first part of the agreement. He sold his car, a 2015 Mustang that was practically the only thing of value he owned, for $12,000. He used the money to pay back the women he had deceived. I know this because two of them contacted me through Facebook to thank me and ask if I really wasn't the person they had dated. I had to explain the embarrassing situation, show photos of myself with Jennifer and the children, prove that my life was real and that Marcus had created an elaborate fantasy. One of them, a nurse named Rachel, told me something that deeply impacted me. She said she had believed Marcus, or rather me, because she was in a vulnerable moment in her life, had just left an abusive relationship, and was looking for someone to make her feel special again. Marcus had exploited that vulnerability, had said exactly what she needed to hear. When I hung up the call with Rachel, I felt the anger against my brother intensify even more. The second part of the deal was the hardest for Marcus, and I knew it. The public post confessing everything. He stalled for a week, making excuses, saying he was trying to find the right words, but I didn't have the patience for it. The following Friday, exactly a week after the meeting at my mother's house, I called Marcus and told him he had until Sunday night to make the post, or I would go to the police on Monday morning. The threat worked. On Saturday afternoon, while I was in the backyard helping Emma with a science project for school, my cell phone started vibrating frantically. It was Facebook notifications. Marcus had made the post. I picked up the phone, my hands still dirty from the garden, and read the words my brother had written. To give him credit, the post didn't try to sugarcoat anything. Marcus wrote that he had created fake profiles on dating apps using his brother's identity, that he had deceived multiple women, arranged dates pretending to be someone else, and even borrowed money under false pretenses. He apologized to the women involved, to his family, and especially to me. He said he was seeking professional help, and that he understood if no one wanted to talk to him anymore. It was short, direct, and devastatingly honest. In the first 30 minutes, the post had 50 comments. In an hour, there were more than 200. People had no mercy. I read some of the comments and immediately regretted it. They were cruel, vindictive, some even threatening. People calling Marcus a psychopath, a predator, human garbage. Old friends saying they always knew there was something wrong with him. Women who weren't even involved in the situation saying men like him should be in prison. There were even people sharing the post and tagging local employers, warning them not to hire Marcus Carter from Portland, Oregon. I had achieved what I wanted. Marcus was being publicly humiliated. His reputation was being destroyed in front of hundreds of people. But as I read those comments, sitting in my backyard on a sunny spring afternoon, I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. I felt something closer to nausea. Jennifer appeared at the back door and called me. He said my mother was on the phone and that it seemed urgent. I went into the kitchen and answered the call. My mother was crying so hard she could barely speak. Between sobs, she told me that Marcus had locked himself in his room after making the post and wasn't answering when she knocked. She was scared, said she'd never seen him so broken. He asked me to go there, that maybe Marcus would listen to me. I looked at Jennifer, who had overheard the conversation through the speakerphone. She nodded, that expression in her eyes that said I should go, that regardless of what Marcus had done, he was still my brother. I grabbed my car keys and left, my heart heavy with a mixture of worry and guilt that I didn't want to admit. The drive to Gresham had never felt so long. Every red light, every slow car in front of me, everything seemed to conspire to slow me down. My mind was racing. What would I say to Marcus? What did I expect to find? Part of me, the rational part, said he was just being dramatic, that he was trying to manipulate the family again to gain sympathy. But another part, smaller and more frightened, wondered if I had pushed my brother too far. If, in my quest for justice, I had forgotten that Marcus, however wrong he was still human. He was still the boy who had shared a room with me for 15 years, who had taught me to play basketball, who had held my hand at our father's funeral. When I arrived at my mother's house, she was on the porch waiting. Her face was pale, her hands clutching a soaked tissue. She practically ran to me when I got out of the car and grabbed my arm, pulling me inside. Marcus's bedroom door on the second floor was closed. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. I stopped in front of the door and knocked, lightly at first, then harder. Nothing. I called his name. Silence. My mother, who had followed me upstairs, whispered that he was inside, she was sure, because she could hear occasional movements. I knocked again, this time more insistently, and said that we needed to talk, that he couldn't hide forever. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard the click of the lock. The door opened a few inches, and I saw Marcus's face peering through the crack. He was unrecognizable. His eyes were so swollen from crying that they looked like two slits. His face was red and bruised. He had his cell phone in his hand, and I could see on the screen that he was on Facebook, reading the comments on his post. I gently pushed the door open and entered the room. It was dark, the curtains drawn, blocking out the late afternoon light. It smelled of sweat and despair. Marcus returned to the bed and sat on the edge, his shoulders hunched, his head down. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Marcus began to speak, his voice hoarse and broken. He said he had read every comment on the post, every hateful private message he had received. He said that people he considered friends had said horrible things about him, that his name was now being shared in Facebook groups dedicated to exposing troubled men, that someone had even created a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag Marcus Carter, where people were sharing stories about him, some true, others clearly fabricated just to join the public lynching. He said his life was over, that he would never get a decent job again, that no one would ever trust him again. And then he looked at me, his eyes filled with tears, and asked if that was what I wanted. If completely destroying his life was what I considered justice. The question hit me like a punch in the gut, because the honest answer was that I didn't know. I hadn't thought about the long-term consequences of what I was doing. I had only thought about making Marcus pay, about making him feel a fraction of what he had made me feel. But looking at him now, seeing the broken man in front of me, I realized that maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe I had crossed the line between justice and revenge. But before I could answer, Marcus continued. He said he understood why I was furious, that he deserved everything that was happening, but that he never imagined it would be like this, so brutal, so public, so permanent. He said he had gone to therapy as I asked, had had his first session that week, and the therapist had said that he probably had serious self-esteem issues and pathological envy that needed to be treated. I sat beside him on the bed, keeping some distance, but close enough to show I was there. I told him he was right, that he deserved consequences for what he did. But I also admitted, for the first time aloud, that maybe I had gone too far with the public post. Marcus looked at me surprised, as if he hadn't expected to hear that from me. Then he did something that caught me completely off guard. He thanked me. He said that for the first time in his life, someone had forced him to truly confront who he was and what he was doing with his life. He said it was painful, worse than anything he had ever felt, but that maybe it was exactly what he needed to finally change. He said he didn't expect my forgiveness, but that he hoped that one day I might at least not regret being his brother. Those words broke me in a way I didn't expect. I felt tears welling up in my own eyes. I placed my hand on Marcus's shoulder, and he broke down. She started crying again, but this time they weren't tears of self-pity or despair. They were tears of someone finally facing the truth about themselves, and there, in that dark room that smelled of defeat, I realized that my revenge had worked better than I imagined, not because it had destroyed Marcus, but because it had forced him to finally look in the mirror and recognize the monster he was becoming. But I also realized something else, that in the process of punishing him, I had become something I didn't like, someone capable of causing deliberate pain, even if justified, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I stayed with Marcus for over an hour that afternoon. We really talked for the first time in years, maybe the first time since we were teenagers. He told me about therapy, about the things the therapist had said, about how he needed to rebuild his life from scratch. I told him about how Jennifer had helped me process everything, about how even the children had noticed the tension and were worried. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. A mutual recognition that we were two imperfect men trying to navigate an impossible situation. When I finally came downstairs, my mother was in the kitchen making tea. She hugged me tightly and whispered thank you. I nodded, but I didn't feel worthy of her gratitude, because deep down I knew that what was happening was far from over, and that the consequences of what I had set in motion were only beginning to reveal themselves. The days following the confrontation in Marcus's room were strange. There was a tension in the air, like that calm before a storm, when you know something is about to happen, but you don't know exactly what. I returned to my routine at the office, but my mind was constantly wandering. During meetings with clients, I found myself thinking about Marcus. During lunches with colleagues, I compulsively checked my phone, hoping for some news. Jennifer noticed the change in me. One Thursday night, after we put the children to bed, she pulled me onto the sofa and made me turn off the TV. She said we needed to talk about the elephant in the room, about the fact that I wasn't present. Not really. I was just going through the motions of life, while my mind was stuck on the drama with my brother. I tried to deny it at first, saying everything was fine, that I just needed time to process. But Jennifer knew me too well. She held my face in her hands and looked me straight in the eyes, that penetrating gaze that always managed to see through any mask I tried to wear. She said she was worried about me, that the revenge I had sought seemed to be consuming me instead of freeing me. She asked if I really felt better now, if Marcus's public humiliation had brought the peace I hoped for. And when she asked that question, I realized the answer was no. In fact, I felt worse. I felt like someone who had won a battle but lost something important in the process, something related to who I thought I was. That weekend, we received an unexpected visit. It was Sunday morning, and I was in the backyard trying to fix a leak in the garden hose when the doorbell rang. Jennifer answered, and a few minutes later she called me in a tense voice. When I entered the room, I found a woman in her early 30s, with blonde hair tied in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a simple blouse. She introduced herself as Michelle Cordova, and said she was one of the women Marcus had deceived. My first instinct was panic, thinking she was there to blame me somehow, to say I should have controlled my brother better. But that wasn't it. Michelle said she had seen Marcus's post, and that unlike the other people who were just throwing hate at him, she felt something different. She felt there was more to the story. Michelle sat in the armchair we offered and began to recount her version of events. She said she had spoken with Marcus, or at least with the person she thought was me, for almost 2 months before finally agreeing to meet in person. She was an elementary school teacher in Beaverton, had just turned 36, and was using dating apps for the first time after 5 years of raising her daughter alone. Marcus had been charming to her, had said all the right things, had shown genuine interest in her life and her daughter. They had met 3 times, always in public places, always long conversations in cafes or walks in the park. Marcus had never tried anything physical, which at the time she thought was respectful, but now understood was because he was afraid of being discovered. What Michelle said next completely surprised me. She said she wasn't there to cause trouble, but to tell me something she thought I should know. The last time she'd met Marcus, he'd seemed different. He was quieter, more reflective. And at the end of the conversation, he'd almost told the truth. He'd said something like he wasn't who she thought he was, that he was living a lie. Michelle had thought it was just some typical male existential crisis and tried to comfort him. But now, looking back, she realized that was the moment when Marcus's conscience was trying to surface. She said that because she wanted me to know that my brother wasn't completely without remorse, that there was a part of him that knew what he was doing was wrong. I don't know why that information affected me so much, but it did. After Michelle left, thanking us for listening and wishing our family could heal, I sat in the living room trying to process it. Jennifer sat beside me and asked what I was thinking. I said I was confused. That part of me wanted to continue hating Marcus completely because it would be easier. But knowing that he had moments of awareness, moments when he almost stopped everything, made things more complicated. It didn't justify what he did, not by a long shot. But it added layers to a situation I had tried to keep in black and white. Jennifer suggested something that surprised me. She said that maybe I should talk to Marcus's therapist, not as a client, but as a family member, to better understand what was happening to him. The idea seemed strange at first, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. The following Tuesday after work, I drove to the office of Dr. Raymond Chen, the therapist Marcus had started seeing. It was a small, cozy room in a commercial building near downtown Portland, with plants in the windows and a tranquil atmosphere. Dr. Chen was a middle-aged man of Chinese descent, with a calm voice and patient manner that immediately put me at ease. I explained the situation, and he said he couldn't discuss the details of the sessions with Marcus because of professional confidentiality, but that he was willing to talk about family dynamics in general and give me some perspective. Dr. Chen asked me questions about my childhood with Marcus, about what our relationship was like when we were young, about how our parents treated us. I answered honestly, recounting how my father always put me on a pedestal for being the eldest and most responsible son, while Marcus was frequently compared to me and considered inadequate. I told him how, after our father died, I automatically assumed the role of family provider, helping my mother financially and trying to guide Marcus. The therapist nodded and then said something that made me stop and think. He said that sometimes, when we grow up in environments where there are constant comparisons, we can develop destructive behavioral patterns. That Marcus had probably internalized the idea that he would never be good enough, and that this had manifested in attempts to sabotage me. But then Dr. Chen said something even more impactful. He asked how I felt about always having been the perfect son, the one who always did everything right. If there was any pressure in that, any weight. And for the first time, I really thought about it. I realized that yes, there was pressure. There was the constant expectation that I would be the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who solved everyone's problems. And maybe part of my anger towards Marcus wasn't just about what he had done, but about the fact that he had allowed himself to fail, to be imperfect, to be human, in ways that I never allowed myself. The therapist didn't say it explicitly, but it was implied in the conversation that Marcus and I were two sides of the same dysfunctional family coin, just dealing with it in different ways. I left that session with a lot on my mind. On the way home, I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, his voice still weak but firmer than it had been days before. I asked how he was doing, and he said he was surviving one day at a time. He said the comments on his post had finally started to decrease, that he had made his profile private and blocked dozens of people. He also said he had gotten a temporary job at a warehouse through an agency that didn't check social media, paying $15 an hour. It wasn't much, but it was something. I told him I was proud of him for moving on, and I felt I truly was. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said he had something to tell me. He said that in the last few weeks of therapy, he had finally begun to understand the roots of what he had done. That it wasn't just about envy, it was about a deep sense of inadequacy he had carried since childhood. That every time I achieved something, finished college, got a better job, bought a house, got married, had children, it was as if a voice in his head told him he would never be capable of it. And that eventually that voice had transformed into anger. Anger at me for having what he wanted, anger at himself for not achieving it, anger at the world for being unfair. Marcus said that creating the fake profiles was a distorted way of trying to prove that I wasn't perfect, that if he could destroy my marriage, perhaps it would make him feel less like a failure. I listened to everything in silence, parking the car in front of my house but not yet getting out. When Marcus finished, I said something I'd been thinking about since the conversation with Dr. Chen. He said I understood, more than he could have imagined, that I too had struggled with expectations and pressures, just in different ways. That perhaps we had both been harmed by the way we were raised, by the constant comparisons, by the family dynamic that cast one of us as the hero and the other as the villain. And that if there was any chance of fixing our relationship, it had to start with both of us recognizing that we were products of circumstances that neither of us completely controlled. Marcus was quiet for a long time, and I heard a muffled sob on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Thank you," and that meant more than I could have known. But as I walked into the house that night, embracing Jennifer and the children, a part of me still wasn't satisfied. Because understanding wasn't the same as forgiving. And even though I was beginning to feel compassion for Marcus, there was still a part of me that wanted to ensure he never did something like that to anyone again. That the lesson would be so profound, so indelible, that it would fundamentally change who he was. And it was at that moment that I realized something disturbing about myself, that perhaps I liked the power I had over Marcus now, the power to have destroyed him and to be deciding if and how he could rebuild himself. It was an ugly thought, a thought that made me question my own character. But it was true. That night, After Jennifer fell asleep, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I thought about everything that had happened in the last few weeks. The discovery of the fake profiles, the confrontation with Marcus, the public humiliation, the conversations with the therapist. And I realized I was at a crossroads. I could choose to move on, accept that Marcus was genuinely trying to change, and begin the long process of rebuilding our relationship. Or I could choose to hold on to the resentment, continue punishing him in subtle ways, constantly reminding him of what he had done. The choice seemed simple in theory, but in practice, with all the emotions still so raw, with the betrayal still so recent, I honestly didn't know which path to choose, and what scared me was that part of me still wanted to see him suffer a little more. I still wanted to make sure he paid completely for what he did, and I didn't know if that made me fair or cruel. Maybe both. The next morning I woke up with renewed determination. I decided I needed real closure, not just a series of emotional conversations that left everything in an uncomfortable limbo. I needed Marcus to do something that proved he had truly changed, something more than just social media posts and weekly therapy, something tangible, something that showed real action, and I knew exactly what it would be. I called Marcus at lunchtime and said we needed to meet, just the two of us, without my mother, without Jennifer, without therapists. Just two brothers trying to resolve years of family dysfunction. He agreed immediately, and we arranged to meet that Friday night at a quiet bar in downtown Portland. A place public enough so there wouldn't be the temptation to let emotions get the better of us, but private enough for us to have a real conversation. And as I counted down the days to that meeting, a part of me wondered if what I was about to ask of him would be the ultimate test of his redemption, or just another way to exert control over someone I wasn't yet sure I could forgive. Friday arrived faster than I expected. I spent the day at the office trying to focus on an important report about an overpass project in Hillsborough, but my mind kept returning to the meeting with Marcus. Jennifer called me at lunchtime to ask how I was feeling. I said I was nervous, which was true, but there was also a sense of anticipation, almost excitement. I had spent the last few days thinking about exactly what I would say, what I would ask for, how I would structure that conversation. Jennifer reminded me to keep an open mind, to really listen to what Marcus had to say before deciding anything. I promised I would, but deep down I already knew I had a well-defined plan in my head. The bar I chose was called The Woodsman, a small, cozy place on Division Street, known for its selection of craft beers and for having a more mature and laid-back clientele. I arrived 15 minutes early and grabbed a table in the corner, with my back to the wall, from where I could see the front door. Old habits of my father, who always said that a man should be able to see who is entering any room. I ordered a local IPA and watched the people around me. Young couples on dates, groups of friends celebrating the end of the work week, some lonely people at the bar flipping through their phones, all living their normal lives, oblivious to the family drama that was about to unfold at that corner table. Marcus arrived exactly on time. He looked better than the last time I saw him. He had shaved and was wearing clean clothes, dark jeans and a blue flannel shirt. But his eyes still had that defeated quality, as if something fundamental had broken inside him and hadn't been completely repaired. He nodded when he saw me and walked to the table with hesitant steps, as if unsure of how he would be received. I stood up and, after a moment of hesitation, offered him my hand. He shook it, and in that handshake there was so much untold history, so much damage, and so much potential for healing, that it almost made me change my mind about everything I was planning. Almost. We were silent for the first few minutes, Marcus ordering a beer, and the two of us just drinking and staring everywhere but at each other. He was the one who finally broke the silence. He asked how Jennifer and the children were. I said they were fine, that Emma was preparing to try out for the school volleyball team, and that our 10-year-old son, Noah, had just won a spelling bee in 5th grade. Marcus smiled, a genuine but sad smile, and said he missed seeing them, that before all this happened he used to come to our house at least twice a month for dinner, and that the children were always excited when Uncle Marcus showed up. This hit me harder than I expected, because it was true. My children had asked about him several times in the last few weeks, and I had given vague excuses about him being busy. So I got straight to the point. I said I'd asked to meet because I needed something more from him, something beyond therapy and public posts and paying women back. Marcus looked at me with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. He asked what it was. I took a deep breath and said I wanted him to work for me. Not in the engineering office. That would be awkward and professionally inappropriate. But I'd just taken on a side project, renovating an old house Jennifer and I had bought as an investment in southeast Portland. The house needed a lot of manual labor, demolition, cleaning, preparation for the professional contractors. I wanted Marcus to be my handyman for the next 3 months, weekends and some nights. Unpaid. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, processing. Then he asked why I wanted him working for free, doing hard labor, when he had already publicly humiliated himself and was trying to rebuild his life. I told him the truth. I said I needed to see real commitment, sustained action, not just words and promises, that anyone could make a Facebook post or go to a few therapy sessions, but showing up week after week, doing hard and sometimes degrading work, showing that he was willing to actually repay his debt to me in a tangible way, that would be different. That would show character. And more than that, I said, it would be a chance for both of us to spend time together, rebuild some kind of relationship through shared work, like we did when we were young, helping our father with projects around the house. The unspoken truth, which I didn't mention but which we both understood, was that this was also another form of punishment. To keep him under my control, to continue exerting power over him. Marcus clearly understood this. I saw a glint of anger, of resentment in his eyes, but then something changed. He sighed, took a long swig of beer and said he was in, that if this was what I needed to start trusting him again, to eventually consider forgiving him, then he would do it. He only asked if this meant that after 3 months, after proving he was serious about changing, we could try to be real brothers again. I said I couldn't promise anything, but that it was a start. He nodded, and we shook hands again, sealing the deal. We started the following Saturday. The house Jennifer and I bought was a 1942 construction. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, in a deplorable state. The previous owner had been a hoarder, and there were literally tons of junk to remove. Old furniture, piles of yellowed newspapers, boxes of random items that no one had touched in decades. The smell was awful, a mixture of mold, dust, and decay. When Marcus arrived at 8 o'clock that Saturday morning wearing old clothes and work gloves, I was already there with a rented truck parked out front. I explained the job. We needed to remove everything from the house, separate what could be donated, what could be recycled, and what was just trash for the landfill. We worked in silence for the first hour, the only sound being the dragging of boxes and the carrying of furniture. It was hard, sweaty work, the kind that leaves your muscles aching and your hands covered in dirt no matter how many gloves you wear. I watched Marcus out of the corner of my eye as we worked. He didn't complain once, just did what needed to be done, carrying box after box, dragging old sofas downstairs, filling garbage bags with decades of accumulated trash. Around noon, we took a break. We sat on the front steps of the house, drinking ice water from a cooler I had brought. Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at the growing pile of trash on the sidewalk. He said it was too much trash for one lifetime, that it made you think about what really matters. That comment started our first real conversation of the day. I said I was thinking the same thing, that it's easy to accumulate things, physical and emotional baggage, and that sometimes you need a radical cleansing to see what's really worth keeping. Marcus understood the metaphor. He said his life in recent months had been exactly that, a radical cleansing, that he had lost his reputation, most of his friends, any illusion about who he thought he was, and that now he was trying to figure out what to build in its place. I asked what the therapist was saying about it. Marcus said that Dr. Chen was helping him understand that he needed to build an identity that wasn't defined in relation to me, that he wasn't the failed brother of the successful Daniel. He was just Marcus, with his own strengths and weaknesses, and he needed to learn to be comfortable with that. We continued working until late afternoon. When we finally finished emptying the first floor of the house, we were both exhausted. I told Marcus he had done a good job, and that I hoped to see him again next week. He nodded, and as he was about to get into his car, an old Honda Civic that our mother had lent him after he sold the Mustang, he turned and said something unexpected. He said he knew I was doing it in part to punish him, and that it was okay, that he understood and accepted it, but that he also hoped that while we worked together, I could see that he was really trying to change. Not through words, but through actions. I didn't say anything, just nodded and watched as he drove away. That night, Jennifer asked me how it had been. I was in the bathtub, soaking in hot water, trying to soothe my aching muscles, when she came in and sat on the edge. I told her about the day, about work, about the conversation we had. Jennifer looked at me with that thoughtful expression she has when she's analyzing something deeply. Then she asked if I thought I was being fair to Marcus, if making him work for free for 3 months was really about giving him a chance to prove he'd changed, or if it was about maintaining control and continuing to punish him. I honestly said I didn't know, that it was probably a bit of both. Jennifer nodded and said that as long as I was honest with myself about my motivations, she would support me. But she reminded me not to let revenge become my identity, not to let what Marcus did turn me into someone I wouldn't recognize. The following weeks established a pattern. Every Saturday and some Sundays, Marcus would show up at the renovation house and we would work together. We ripped up old carpet, removed peeling wallpaper, demolished a non-structural wall between the kitchen and the dining room. The work was hard, but there was also something strangely therapeutic about it, something about the physical exertion, about seeing tangible progress, about transforming something broken into something new. And while we worked, we talked, not always, and not about deep things all the time. Sometimes it was just about sports, or a news story we'd seen, or childhood memories that weren't painful. But occasionally we had real conversations about what had happened, about how we were feeling, about the future. During one of those conversations, Marcus told me something I didn't know. He said that when he first created the fake profiles, it wasn't to destroy my marriage, at least not consciously. It was because he wanted to know what it was like to be me. He wanted to experience what it would be like to have women interested in him, not because Marcus was the failure, but because he was Daniel, the successful and married engineer. He said he became addicted to the attention, to the way the women responded to his messages, how genuinely interested they seemed in meeting him. And it was only later, when he realized that one of them had contacted Jennifer, that the fantasy began to transform into something darker. That he thought that if my marriage ended, perhaps it would prove that I wasn't as perfect as everyone thought, that I was as fallible as he was, as he. Hearing that gave me a different perspective on the whole situation. It didn't excuse what Marcus had done, not by a long shot. But it humanized him. It showed that it wasn't some evil master plan to destroy me, but rather a series of progressively worse decisions born from deep insecurity and unprocessed envy. And as we ripped old bathroom tiles off that day, working side by side in a cramped space, I realized something. That maybe my revenge shouldn't be about making Marcus suffer. Maybe it should be about forcing him to grow, to face his demons, to become the person he had the potential to be, but had never allowed himself to try. And maybe, just maybe, in the process of helping him do that, I could also confront some of my own demons. The expectations I carried, the need to be perfect, the fear of failure that made me judge so harshly those who failed. But then something happened that changed everything. It was the 5th week of our arrangement, a particularly hot Saturday in June. We were working on the 2nd floor, removing an old insulation installation that was infested with mold, when Marcus's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his face went pale. He answered the call, and I could only hear his side of the conversation. It was short, tense, and when he hung up, his hands were trembling. I asked what had happened. Marcus looked at me with panicked eyes and said it was one of the women he had cheated on, one he didn't know existed. Apparently, she was pregnant and claiming that he, or rather I, was the father. And she was threatening to go to the local press with the story if she didn't receive $50,000 in 3 days. The world seemed to stop at that moment. I stared at Marcus, trying to process what he had just said, but my brain refused to accept it. A pregnant woman, $50,000, a threat to go to the press. Each word felt like a hammer hitting my head. Marcus was clearly panicking, pacing back and forth in the small room, his hands in his hair, breathing rapidly. It took me a few minutes to regain my composure. When I finally spoke, I asked for details. Who she was, when they had met, what exactly she had said. Marcus picked up his phone with trembling hands and showed me the messages the woman had sent before calling. Her name was Vanessa Rodriguez. 32 years old, she worked as a manager at a retail store in Tigard. From the messages, she and Marcus had met 4 times over 2 months, between February and April. She sent photos of herself pregnant, clearly several months along with an image of a positive pregnancy test, dated May. Vanessa wrote that she had tried to contact Marcus through apps, but discovered that all profiles had been deleted, so she did a reverse image search, found my real LinkedIn profile, and eventually located Marcus's phone number through our mother, who naively gave the information when Vanessa called, pretending to be a former co-worker. The messages were direct and threatening. Either Marcus paid $50,000 by Tuesday, or she would go to the local media with the full story of how a married civil engineer from Portland had deceived her and abandoned her while pregnant. I felt the anger surging like a wave. Not just anger, but a visceral fury that made me want to punch something. Marcus had assured me that he had never gone beyond public meetings, that he had never been physically involved with any of the women. And now this. I grabbed Marcus by the collar of his shirt and pushed him against the wall, my voice coming out as a growl. I asked if he had slept with her, if he had lied to me about how far things had gone. Marcus was trembling, tears starting to stream down his face. He swore he hadn't, that he had never been in a room alone with either of them, that he always kept everything public precisely because he was afraid something like this would happen. He said Vanessa must be lying, trying to pull a fast one, because there was no way he could be the father if they had never done anything more than talk and walk in the park. I let go of Marcus and took a few steps back, trying to control my breathing, trying to think rationally. Jennifer. I needed to call Jennifer. She would know what to do. She always knew how to handle complicated legal situations. I picked up my phone and called. Jennifer answered on the second ring, excited because she had just returned from shopping with Emma. When I explained the situation, the joy in her voice instantly evaporated. She was silent for a moment, processing, then switched into lawyer mode. She told us not to pay anything, not to respond to the threats, and for Marcus and me to go home immediately. She would already be making some calls to colleagues who dealt with extortion and defamation cases. I agreed, hung up, and looked at Marcus, and looked I told him we were leaving now, that he would follow me home, and that he shouldn't do absolutely anything until we spoke to Jennifer. The drive back was a blur. My mind was racing in 1,000 different directions. What if Vanessa really went to the press? My name would be dragged through the mud, associated with a scandal of betrayal and abandonment. My work could be affected. My clients could lose confidence in me. Worse still, Emma and Noah would have to deal with it at school, with other children asking questions, with whispers and stares. And all because of Marcus's lies. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers turned white. When we got home, Jennifer was already in the living room with her laptop open, papers scattered across the coffee table. She had that focused and determined expression she always had when she was working on a difficult case. Marcus and I sat while Jennifer asked us methodical questions. Exact dates of the meetings, locations, whether there were witnesses, whether Marcus had saved any messages from the original conversations before deleting the profiles. Marcus had some screenshots he had saved, showing conversations with Vanessa that were all innocent, talking about movies, food, places they wanted to visit. Nothing even remotely suggestive or indicating any kind of physical intimacy. Jennifer studied everything carefully, taking notes. Then she looked up and said there were two possibilities. First, Vanessa was pregnant by someone else and was trying to extort money from Marcus, taking advantage of the confusing situation with the fake profiles. Second, and less likely, she actually believed Marcus was the father for some delusional reason or was having a psychological crisis. Jennifer said the best course of action was to respond to Vanessa through a lawyer, making it clear that there would be no payment and that any attempt to go to the press with false allegations would result in a lawsuit for defamation and extortion. She had already contacted a colleague specializing in these cases, a lawyer named Thomas Brennan, who agreed to meet with us on Monday morning. Until then, none of us should have any contact with Vanessa. Marcus nodded, still pale and clearly terrified. I just sat there feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. After another hour discussing details and strategies, Jennifer said Marcus should go home, try to rest, and that we would meet at the lawyer's office on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. After Marcus left, I collapsed onto the sofa. Jennifer sat beside me and placed her hand on mine. I looked at her and asked how this could be happening. How could a situation that was already terrible get any worse? Jennifer said that things often get worse before they get better, that it's part of the process of resolving any complicated conflict. But she also said something that made me stop. She asked if I believed Marcus when he said he had never been physically involved with either of the women. I thought about it. Despite all the anger, despite all the betrayal, there was something in Marcus's reaction, in the genuine panic in his eyes, that made me believe he was telling the truth. I told Jennifer this and she nodded. I said that then we needed to trust in that and fight Vanessa with everything we had. The weekend was torturous. I couldn't sleep properly, staying awake imagining increasingly worse scenarios. Vanessa going to the press, the story spreading across social media, co-workers looking at me suspiciously, having to explain to my daughters why there were pregnant women saying I was the father. On Sunday, I tried to keep up appearances for the children. We went to church in the morning, something we didn't do every week, but that Jennifer insisted we do that day. She said we needed some normalcy, some routine. Afterwards, we went to lunch at Sharry's, a family restaurant the children loved. But I could barely eat, just pushing the omelette across the plate, while Emma and Noah chatted excitedly about their plans for the summer holidays that would start in a few weeks. On Monday morning, I arrived at Thomas Brennan's office 15 minutes early. It was an impressive office on the 20th floor of a building in downtown Portland, overlooking the Willamette River. Jennifer was already there, chatting with the receptionist. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, wearing the only suit he owned, old and a little tight, but he had made an effort. Thomas Brennan greeted us in a huge conference room with a polished mahogany desk. He was a man in his 50s, with grey hair combed back, an expensive suit, and a presence that commanded respect. He had us sit down and began asking questions similar to Jennifer's, but more detailed, more focused on the legal aspects. After 45 minutes of questioning, Thomas leaned back in his chair and gave his diagnosis. He said that in his opinion, there was a 90% chance that Vanessa was attempting a scam. The signs were all there. The specific request for $50,000, not $100,000 or $200,000, which would be more typical of someone genuinely trying to secure child support, but an amount that seemed significant without being completely impossible. The short 3-day deadline designed to create panic and force a hasty decision. And the fact that she had waited until now, when the profiles were already deleted and the situation was public, to make the allegations. If she truly believed Marcus was the father, she would have made contact much sooner. Thomas said he would send Vanessa a cease and desist letter that afternoon, making it clear that any future communication would have to go through him, and that false public allegations would result in immediate legal action. We left the office feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. The relief came from having a competent professional handling the situation. The apprehension stemmed from knowing that we might still only be at the beginning of a long and ugly battle. Marcus thanked me repeatedly for not abandoning him, for bringing Jennifer and lawyers instead of simply leaving him to deal with the consequences alone. I said that despite everything that had happened, he was still my brother, and that family doesn't abandon family in times like these, no matter how complicated the situation. But I also made it clear that this didn't change our agreement. He would still need to complete the 3 months of work on the home renovation. If anything, this had proven that he needed all the structure and discipline he could get. On Tuesday, the deadline Vanessa had given, we heard nothing from her. Thomas Brennan kept us informed, saying she had received the letter but hadn't responded yet. Wednesday passed, then Thursday. Friday morning, Thomas called. Vanessa had responded through her own lawyer, a fellow Thomas knew and described as someone who took dubious cases if the payment was good enough. The response denied it was extortion, stated Vanessa had the right to tell her story, but notably made no further specific mention of the $50,000 payment. Thomas said this was a good sign, meaning they were backing down, testing to see if we really intended to fight. But then the following Monday, 2 weeks after the initial threat, the bomb dropped. Vanessa didn't go to the mainstream press as she had threatened. Instead, she did something more insidious. She posted her story on a popular local blog called Portland Confessions, a website where people anonymously shared scandalous stories about the city. The post didn't use my full name, just my initials and details, vague enough to avoid obvious legal problems, but specific enough that anyone who knew me could make the connection. She recounted how she had met a married civil engineer on a dating app, how they had had a brief but intense affair, how she had become pregnant, and how, when she tried to contact him, she discovered he had used a false identity and disappeared completely. The post went viral locally within hours. It had hundreds of comments, most expressing solidarity with Vanessa and condemning the mysterious man who had abandoned her. Some people started speculating in the comments about who it could be, sharing LinkedIn profiles of civil engineers from Portland. My name came up in some speculations, though I wasn't the only one. Thomas Brennan called as soon as he saw the post. He said that technically Vanessa had been clever, keeping everything vague enough to make it difficult to sue for defamation, but that it wasn't impossible, especially if we could prove she knew she was lying. He strongly recommended that we consider taking more aggressive legal action, including possibly demanding a paternity test through the court once the child was born, to publicly prove that neither Marcus nor I were the father. Jennifer agreed with Thomas, but I hesitated, because going to court would mean dragging everything into the public eye even further. It would mean Emma and Noah would definitely find out, that I would have to sit with my children and explain a situation I could barely understand myself. It would mean that every person in my office, every client, every acquaintance would know about the drama. And even if we proved in the end that neither Marcus nor I were the father, the stain would remain. People would always remember the story, the accusation, more than the vindication. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with Jennifer after the children went to bed, I finally let it all out. All the emotions I had been suppressing for the past few weeks. I cried for the first time since it all began. I cried for the loss of the simplicity my life had before. I cried for the broken relationship with my brother. I cried for the fear of what was still to come. Jennifer held me while I cried, saying nothing, just being there. When I finally calmed down, she said something I'll never forget. She said revenge was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. That I had started all this wanting to make Marcus pay, wanting to see him suffer, and that on some level I had achieved that. But that in the process I was suffering too, that it was consuming my peace, my joy, my sense of security, and that maybe it was time to consider a different approach. Not complete forgiveness, not yet, but at least start letting go of some control, some of the anger, start focusing more on healing than on punishing. I knew she was right, but knowing something intellectually and being able to act on it emotionally were completely different things. The days following Vanessa's post on Portland Confessions were some of the strangest of my life. I found myself constantly checking the site, reading the new comments, trying to see if anyone had made the definitive connection to my name. At work, I was paranoid, imagining that every whispered conversation between colleagues was about me, that every glance was judgmental. Jennifer told me to stop looking at the blog, that it was just torturing me for no reason. But I couldn't help it. It was like a wound you can't stop picking at, even knowing it will only get worse. Marcus called every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times, asking if there was any news, if Thomas had discovered anything more about Vanessa. His guilt was palpable in every word, in every pause in the conversation. On Thursday of that week, something unexpected happened. I received a message on LinkedIn from a woman named Sarah Kim. She identified herself as a freelance investigative journalist who occasionally wrote for the Willamette Week and other local newspapers. Sarah said she had seen the post on Portland Confessions and started investigating on her own because something about the story didn't add up. She had managed to identify Vanessa Rodriguez through some details in the post and had started asking questions, and what she discovered was disturbing. Vanessa had a history of similar accusations against different men over the past 5 years. Twice before, she had claimed to be pregnant by men she met online, demanded money, and then disappeared when things got too complicated. I immediately forwarded Sarah's message to Thomas Brennan and Jennifer. Thomas called Sarah and had a long conversation with her, verifying her sources and information. Everything checked up. Sarah had documentation of at least 2 previous cases, where Vanessa had used essentially the same scheme. In one case in Eugene 3 years ago, she had even accepted a $25,000 payment from a terrified man before disappearing, and when he tried to sue her, he discovered she had used part of a false name and was impossible to locate. Thomas said this changed everything. With evidence of a pattern of fraudulent behavior, we had a much stronger case, both criminally and civilly. He recommended that we contact the Portland police and file a formal complaint of attempted extortion. But before we could do that, Sarah Kim published her article. It appeared in the online edition of Willamette Week on Monday morning with the devastating headline, "Serial Pregnancy Scammer Targets Portland Men in Extortion Scheme." The article meticulously detailed Vanessa Rodriguez's history, her previous schemes, and connected the dots to the recent Portland Confessions post. Sarah had done impressive investigative work, finding Vanessa's previous victims and getting two of them to speak anonymously about their experiences. The article didn't mention my name or Marcus's directly, maintaining our privacy, but it made it very clear that the recent Portland Confessions post was part of an established pattern of fraud. The article's comment section exploded, with people expressing shock and anger at Vanessa's audacity. The article had an immediate ripple effect. Portland police opened an investigation into Vanessa Rodriguez. The Portland Confessions blog removed her post and issued an apology for not verifying the story before publishing it. And most importantly for me, the speculation about my identity stopped completely. People who had been commenting and trying to figure out who the mysterious civil engineer was were now focused on Vanessa and how many more men she might have victimized over the years. I felt like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It didn't solve everything. It didn't erase the trauma of the last few weeks, but at least the immediate threat to my reputation had been neutralized. Marcus came to my house that night unannounced, bringing an expensive bottle of bourbon that clearly cost more than he could afford with his warehouse salary. He said he wanted to celebrate, that something had finally worked out, that at least this part of the nightmare was ending. I let him in, but made it clear I wasn't in the mood for celebration. Because even with Vanessa's situation resolved, there was still so much damage, so much unprocessed pain between us. Marcus understood. He put the bourbon away, unopened, and sat on the sofa, hands between his knees, head down. He said he understood if I wanted to cancel our agreement about working on the renovation project, that he had caused enough trouble and he wouldn't expect me to still want him around. But I didn't cancel. I told Marcus that, on the contrary, now more than ever, he needed to follow through with the commitment, because the situation with Vanessa had proven something important. It had proven that the consequences of his actions were far broader and more lasting than any of us had initially imagined. That each fake profile he created, each woman he deceived, had the potential to explode into new crises in ways we couldn't foresee. And that if he truly wanted to change, truly wanted to become someone different, he needed the structure and discipline that our agreement provided. Marcus nodded, silent tears streaming down his face. He said I was right, that he would continue to show up every Saturday, that he would prove he was capable of real commitment. The following Saturday, we returned to work on the renovation house. We had finished the demolition and cleanup, and now we were beginning the reconstruction phase. More technical, more precise work. I had hired professional electricians and plumbers for the specialized parts, but there was much that Marcus and I could do ourselves. Installing new drywall, painting, laying laminate flooring, replacing windows. It was work that required attention to detail, patience, and the ability to follow instructions. And as we worked, I began to see real changes in Marcus. He arrived on time, sometimes even early. He didn't complain, didn't make excuses, he just did the work. And more than that, he began to take pride in what we were creating together. One afternoon, while we were installing new baseboards in the living room, Marcus commented on how satisfying it was to build something tangible. He said that in recent years he had jumped from job to job, never staying long enough in any one place to see the results of his work, that it was always meaningless tasks, work that anyone could do, nothing that made him feel it really mattered. But here, in that house, he could see the progress. He could see how what we did on Saturday was still there the following Saturday, how each piece we installed remained and became part of something bigger. He said that Dr. Chen had talked about this in therapy, about how people like him needed tangible milestones of achievement to build genuine self-esteem, and that for the first time in a long time, he felt he was contributing to something real. Those words touched me more than I expected, because I realized that during all the weeks we'd been working together, something had changed between us too. The anger I carried, that hot white fury that consumed me whenever I thought about what Marcus had done, had begun to cool. It hadn't disappeared. Perhaps it would never completely disappear, but it had transformed into something more manageable. Something more like deep disappointment than visceral hatred, and in place of that anger, something unexpected began to grow, a kind of reluctant respect for the effort Marcus was making. He had shown up every week for 2 months now, had worked hard, had accepted direction and criticism without complaining. This didn't erase what he had done, but it showed that he was capable of real change, not just empty words. One evening, returning home after a particularly long day of work around the house, I called my mother. We hadn't spoken much since that terrible night at her house when everything initially exploded. She answered the children's calls, spoke briefly with me about practical matters, but there was a distance that hadn't existed before. When she answered, her voice sounded tired, older somehow. I asked how she was, and there was a long pause before she answered. She said she was coping with everything, day by day, trying not to think too much about what had happened to her family. She asked about Marcus, if he was really improving or if it was just a facade. I honestly said that I thought it was real, that I saw genuine changes in him, but that it would take time to rebuild trust completely. My mother then said something that surprised me. She said she was proud of me, not only for how I had handled the situation with Marcus, but for not simply cutting him out of my life completely, which would have been the easiest thing to do. She said she knew I was making him work around the house, partly as punishment, but that she also saw it as a complicated act of love. An older brother refusing to give up on his younger brother, even when it would be justified to do so. Her words made me question my own motivations again. Was it love, or was it just a more elaborate form of control and revenge? Maybe it was both. Maybe life was too complicated for simple answers. I told my mother I was trying to do what I thought was right, even though I wasn't sure what that meant most days. By the end of the 10th week of our agreement, the renovated house was almost unrecognizable. What had been a dilapidated structure full of junk now had clean white walls, new laminate oak floors, windows that actually closed properly, and a modernized kitchen with stainless steel appliances that Jennifer had snagged on a Home Depot sale. Only 2 more weeks remained to complete our 3-month agreement, and then, theoretically, Marcus would be free of his obligation. But that Saturday, while we were putting the finishing touches on the exterior paint, Marcus said something that caught me by surprise. He said that when the 3 months were up, if I let him, he'd like to continue helping until we completely finished the house, not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to see the project completed. He wanted to be there when we put the "for sale" sign out front. I looked at my brother, the man who had caused so much chaos in my life, and I saw something different. I no longer saw the manipulative and envious Marcus who had created fake profiles to destroy me. I saw someone who was genuinely trying to fix himself, piece by piece, in the same way we were fixing that house. Not perfect, far from it. There were still moments when I saw glimpses of the old Marcus, the tendency to play the victim, the defensiveness when criticized. But there was also real growth, real change. He told Marcus that we could discuss this when the 3 months were over, but that he appreciated the offer, and in that moment something passed between us, an unspoken recognition that perhaps, eventually, we could find a way back to being real brothers. But I still wasn't ready to forgive completely. There was still a part of me that wanted to make sure Marcus never forgot what he'd done, that the lesson would be so deeply ingrained that it became a permanent part of who he was. Jennifer repeatedly told me I needed to let it go, that holding on to the anger was hurting me more than it was hurting Marcus, but I couldn't, not yet, because every time I started to feel like maybe I could relax, maybe I could trust again, something happened that reminded me why I was so furious in the first place. Like when Emma casually asked me at dinner why Uncle Marcus didn't come to visit anymore, and I had to make up some vague excuse about him being busy with work and therapy. Or when a client in the office made a comment about online identity theft, and I felt my stomach clench even though I knew he wasn't talking about me. The truth was, I was trapped between wanting to let go and not being able to. Trapped between seeing Marcus's genuine progress and not being able to forget the betrayal. Trapped between what Jennifer said I should do and what I truly felt. And as that summer progressed, with the days growing longer and hotter, working side by side with my brother every week, I wondered if I would ever find real resolution. If I would ever wake up without that weight on my chest, without that residual anger that colored everything I did. Or if this was simply who I was now, who Marcus had turned me into. A man who had learned that even family could betray you in the worst possible ways, and that this lesson would never be unlearned. The 11th week began differently. It was early July, and Portland was experiencing a brutal heat wave, with temperatures nearing 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Working on the renovation house became almost unbearable during the hottest hours of the day, so Marcus and I adjusted our schedule, starting at 6 in the morning to take advantage of the cooler hours. On that particular Saturday, when I arrived at the house at 5:55, Marcus was already there, sitting on the front steps with 2 cups of iced coffee he had picked up at Starbucks on the way. He handed me one, and in that small gesture there was something that made me pause. It was genuine consideration, forward thinking about what I might need. Small things, but significant. We started the day working in the second-floor bathroom, installing new tiles in the shower stall. It was meticulous work that required precision. Each tile needed to be perfectly level and spaced. Marcus was focused, measuring and smoothing before applying each piece. Sometime during the morning, while we worked in comfortable silence, my phone rang. It was Emma. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. My heart immediately raced, thinking of accidents, medical emergencies, all the terrible things parents imagine. It took me a few minutes to calm her down enough to understand what was happening. It wasn't a physical emergency. It was something different, something that in many ways was worse, because I couldn't simply fix it with a Band-Aid or a trip to the hospital. Emma had found out about Marcus and the fake profiles. One of her school friends, whose mother apparently knew someone who had seen Marcus's original Facebook post months ago, had casually mentioned it during a sleepover the night before. The friend didn't know she was talking about Emma's uncle, just sharing a juicy tidbit about some guy from Portland who had pretended to be her brother on dating apps. But Emma had made the connections, pressed for more details, and eventually the truth had come out. Now she wanted to know if it was true, if Uncle Marcus had really done it, and why no one had told her. Why her parents had lied, saying Marcus was just busy when something much more serious was actually happening. I looked at Marcus, who had stopped working and was watching me with an expression of growing concern. I told Emma I'd be right back home, that we'd talk about everything, and that I was sorry she'd found out this way. When I hung up, Marcus asked what had happened. I told him, and I saw guilt spread across his face like a stain. He said he was so sorry, that he'd never thought about how it would affect the children, that he'd been so focused on his own issues that he hadn't considered the wider impact. I just nodded, picked up my tools, and said I needed to go. Marcus offered to come with me to help explain, but I said no. This was something Jennifer and I needed to deal with as parents. It wasn't his place yet. When I got home, I found Emma in her room, lying on her bed hugging her pillow, her eyes red from crying. Noah was in the living room playing video games, oblivious to the drama, just a 10-year-old boy, blissfully ignorant of the complexities of adult life. Jennifer was sitting on the edge of Emma's bed, stroking her hair, trying to comfort her. When Emma saw me, she sat up immediately and bombarded me with questions. Why had Uncle Marcus done that? How could he be so cruel? And why hadn't we told her? She was 14, not a child. She deserved to know the truth about her own family. Each question was like a knife, because she was absolutely right. We should have told her, prepared her for the possibility of finding out in other ways. Jennifer and I spent the next hour sitting with Emma, telling her the whole story. Not all the sordid details, but enough for her to understand what had happened and why. We talked about how Uncle Marcus was struggling with deep personal issues, how he had made terrible choices, and how he was now trying to do better. We talked about therapy, about how sometimes people we love disappoint us, but that doesn't mean we stop loving them or giving them chances to change. Emma listened to everything, processing it, asking occasional questions. At the end, she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. She asked if I had forgiven Uncle Marcus. I looked at Jennifer, then back at my daughter, and told the truth. I said I was trying, but that it was difficult, and that forgiveness wasn't something that happened all at once, but was a long process. Emma thought about it for a moment, then said something surprisingly mature for a 14-year-old girl. She said she understood being angry with Uncle Marcus, and that he had done something truly awful. But she also remembered all the times he had been nice to her and Noah, all the times he had shown up at their birthdays with carefully chosen gifts, all the times he had sat on the floor to play with them when other adults didn't bother. She said people were complicated, that they could be good and bad at the same time, and that maybe Uncle Marcus was like that. I looked at my daughter, this young girl who was growing up so fast and becoming so wise, and felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in the person she was becoming, sadness because she had been forced to learn lessons about moral complexity earlier than she should have. After that conversation, something changed in me. Maybe it was hearing the truth coming from Emma's mouth, spoken with that uncomplicated clarity that children sometimes have. Maybe it was realizing that by holding on to so much resentment, I wasn't just hurting Marcus or myself, but I was teaching my daughters a lesson about revenge and unforgiveness that I wasn't sure I wanted them to learn. That night, after the children went to bed, I sat with Jennifer on the back deck, drinking red wine and looking at the stars. I told her what Emma had said, and Jennifer smiled. She said that sometimes our children are our best teachers, that they show us truths that we are too close or too stubborn to see ourselves. On Sunday, I called Marcus and asked if he wanted to come over for dinner on Tuesday. He said Emma knew everything now, and that she wanted to see him, wanted to have a conversation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Finally, he asked if I was sure, if I thought it was a good idea. I said yes, that it was time we started trying to normalize things again, and that hiding Marcus from the children wasn't serving anyone. He agreed, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and nervousness. When I hung up, Jennifer hugged me from behind and whispered that she was proud of me. He said this was real progress, that it was the first genuine step toward real healing. Tuesday arrived, and at 6 o'clock in the evening Marcus appeared at our door. He had brought flowers for Jennifer, an apology gift, and new board games for Emma and Noah. When Emma came downstairs and saw Marcus in the doorway, there was a moment of hesitation, both unsure of how to act. Then Emma simply walked over to him and hugged him. He didn't say anything, just hugged her, and I saw tears begin to stream down Marcus's face. He hugged my daughter back, whispering repeated apologies, and at that moment something inside my chest that had been tight for months finally began to loosen a little. Not completely, not yet, but enough that I could breathe a little easier. Dinner was surprisingly normal. Noah, blissfully unaware of all the drama, just chatted animatedly about his summer camp and how he'd learned to kayak. Emma was quieter, watching Marcus carefully but not in a hostile way, just curious, trying to reconcile the person she knew with the terrible things she'd learned he'd done. Marcus was clearly nervous, eating little, answering questions but not volunteering much. After dinner, when Jennifer took Noah upstairs to start the bedtime routine, Emma asked to speak with Marcus alone. I hesitated, but Jennifer gave me a look that said to trust her, so I left the room, staying close enough to intervene if necessary, but giving them space. I didn't hear everything that was said, but I caught fragments. Emma asking Marcus why he did that, Marcus trying to explain envy and insecurity in ways a 14-year-old girl could understand. Emma saying she was disappointed in him but wanted to believe he was changing. Marcus saying he understood and that he would spend the rest of his life proving he deserved a second chance. When they finally entered the room 20 minutes later, both had red eyes but seemed lighter somehow. Emma looked at me and said she had told Uncle Marcus that she forgave him, but that he couldn't disappoint the family again. Marcus nodded solemnly and said he wouldn't. And seeing my 14-year-old daughter give Marcus something I was still struggling to give, genuine and conditional forgiveness, made me realize how far I still had to go. After Marcus left that night, Emma came over to me while I was washing the dishes. She stood beside me in silence for a moment, then asked if I was angry with her for forgiving Uncle Marcus. I dried my hands and turned to look at her. I said no, that I was actually impressed by her capacity for forgiveness, and that perhaps she was a better person than me in that respect. Emma hugged me and said something that stayed with me. She said she had learned in history class about how sometimes people do horrible things, but that history is also full of examples of people who changed, who redeemed themselves, and that Uncle Marcus deserved the chance to be one of those redemption stories, not one of the sad stories of people who messed everything up and never recovered. In the following weeks, Marcus continued coming to work on the renovation every Saturday, as had been the agreement. But now he also came for dinner once a week on Tuesdays, and gradually things began to seem more normal. Not exactly as they were before, they would never be exactly as before, but a new version of normal. A version where everyone knew what had happened, where the wounds were still fresh but beginning to heal. And as we installed the finishing touches on the renovation, putting doorknobs on the doors and mirrors in the bathrooms, I realized that perhaps we were doing more than just renovating an old house. Perhaps we were also renovating our relationship, piece by piece, one conversation at a time. But even with all this progress, there were still moments when the anger returned, moments when I saw Marcus laughing with the children and remembered how much he had risked, how close he had come to destroying everything. Moments when Jennifer casually mentioned seeing a news story about identity theft, and I felt my stomach clench. Moments when I woke up in the middle of the night, remembering those terrible days when I first discovered the fake profiles. In those moments, I had to consciously remind myself to breathe, to let the anger pass, to focus on the progress we had made and not on the pain of the past. It was constant work, exhausting at times, but necessary, because the alternative was to let the anger consume me completely, and I had seen where that path led. It led to more pain, more isolation, more destruction. The home renovation was finally completed in the first week of August, almost 4 months after Marcus and I started the project together. Jennifer hired a staging company to furnish the house for photos and viewings, and when it was listed on Zillow and Redfin, it looked unrecognizable from the dilapidated structure it had been. The asking price was $350,000, a significant increase over the $210,000 we paid for it. Marcus came to the house one last time the day before we opened for viewings, just the two of us, walking through the rooms in silence, admiring the work we had done. Every wall we painted, every floor we installed, every tile we laid. It was more than just a renovated house. It was a testament to months of hard work, difficult conversations, small and painful steps towards something that could eventually be called reconciliation. The house sold in less than 2 weeks, A young couple with a baby on the way, both high school teachers, made an offer of $360,000, $10,000 above the asking price. Jennifer handled all the paperwork and negotiations, and at the beginning of September, we signed the closing. After deducting renovation costs, materials, closing fees, and the real estate agent's commission, we still came away with a net profit of about $100,000. It was a good return on investment, and more importantly, it represented the official end of the agreement Marcus and I had made. 4 months of work. He had fulfilled his part, showing up every week without fail, working hard, never complaining even when the work was unpleasant or the weather was brutal. The day after the closing, I invited Marcus to lunch at an Italian restaurant we used to go to with our father when we were young. He arrived wearing a clean dress shirt, not the old, tight suit, but a new one he had clearly bought for the occasion. We sat at a table near the window, ordered food we barely touched, and finally had the conversation we both knew was pending. I told Marcus that he had fulfilled his part of our agreement, that he had shown commitment and consistency over the 4 months, and that I recognized and appreciated that. But I also said that there was still work to be done, not on the house now, but on our relationship, on rebuilding trust that had been completely destroyed. Marcus nodded, his hands nervously tearing a piece of Italian bread. He said he understood that he hadn't expected 4 months of manual labor to erase what he had done, but he also said that those 4 months had changed him in ways he was still processing. He said the physical work, the weekly commitment, the structure and discipline I had imposed had given him something he had never had before. A sense of purpose, a routine that wasn't based on escaping his responsibilities, but on facing them head-on. Marcus said that Dr. Chen had commented in therapy on how transformative the housework had been for him, how it had provided a tangible framework for his emotional and psychological recovery. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket and pushed it across the table toward me. He told me to open it. Inside was a check for $10,000, made out to me, signed by Marcus. I looked at him confused, not understanding. Marcus explained that over the past 4 months, in addition to his work at the warehouse, he had gotten some freelance work doing graphic design, a skill he had developed years ago but had never taken seriously. He said it wasn't much money, just small projects here and there, but that he had saved every penny, living on the bare minimum, still living with our mother and spending almost nothing, and that he wanted to give me that money as an acknowledgement of all the emotional and financial cost his betrayal had caused. I stared at the check, feeling conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to accept it, to see it as a genuine gesture of remorse and responsibility, but another part felt uncomfortable, as if accepting the money would make our entire relationship transactional, as if I could put a monetary value on betrayal and reconciliation. I pushed the check back and said I couldn't accept it, that what I needed from him wasn't money, but an ongoing commitment to his change, to therapy, to being a better person. Marcus insisted, said he needed to do it, that it was important for him to feel he was paying his debt in a tangible way. We were at an impasse for a few minutes, neither of us wanting to give in. Finally, Jennifer, whom I had invited to join us after we finished our initial conversation, arrived at the restaurant. She immediately sensed the tension at the table and asked what was going on. I explained about the check, about the disagreement between Marcus and me. Jennifer took the check, examined it, then looked at Marcus with that analytical expression she used when considering all the variables of a situation. She said she understood Marcus's impulse to want to make financial restitution, but that she agreed with me that accepting the money directly would create an awkward dynamic. Then she proposed an alternative solution. She suggested that Marcus donate the $10,000 to a non-profit organization that helps victims of identity theft and online fraud. The suggestion was perfect. It allowed Marcus to make his restitution gesture without turning our relationship into a transactional one. And more importantly, it directed the money towards something that could truly help other people who had suffered from the kind of crime he had committed. Marcus thought about it for a moment, then agreed. He said he would make the donation that week and send me the receipt as proof. And in that moment, seeing my brother genuinely trying to do the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when it cost him financially, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. A glimmer of true forgiveness, not complete, not yet, but a real beginning. A recognition that Marcus was no longer the person who had created those fake profiles months ago. He was becoming someone different, someone better. After lunch, the three of us strolled through downtown Portland, enjoying one of the last warm summer days before autumn arrived. Marcus told us about the graphic design projects he was working on, how he was considering going back to school to get a formal certificate and turn it into a real career. He talked about therapy, about how he had started attending a support group for men dealing with self-esteem issues and destructive behaviors. He said it was strange at first, being in a room with other men sharing vulnerable stories, but that it had become one of the most valuable parts of his recovery. Hearing other people talk about their struggles, realizing he wasn't alone in his demons, had been deeply comforting. Jennifer and I shared our thoughts as well. We talked about how the last few weeks had been better, how having Marcus back at Tuesday dinners had brought a sense of normalcy that we had lost, how Emma had mentioned it was good to have Uncle Marcus around again, and how even Noah, who had never really understood the whole situation, seemed happier having the whole family together. We discussed the possibility of having Thanksgiving together this year, something we hadn't done since everything blew up. Marcus said he would love to, but understood if it was still too soon, if Jennifer or I weren't ready for it. I said I didn't know that I would need to think about it, but that it was a possibility. When we finally parted that afternoon, Marcus hugged me. It wasn't that quick, awkward hug men sometimes give to fulfill social etiquette. It was a real hug, long, full of unspoken emotion. When he pulled away, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. He said thank you, not just for today, but for everything, for not giving up on him, for giving him a chance to prove he could change. I just nodded, not trusting my own voice at that moment. And as I watched Marcus walk to our mother's borrowed Honda Civic, I saw something I hadn't seen in him in years. Upright posture, confident steps, the body language of someone who was beginning to respect himself again. That night, lying in bed with Jennifer beside me, I reflected on everything that had happened in the last few months. From that terrible afternoon when Jennifer showed me the fake profiles, to today, when Marcus embraced me with genuine gratitude. It had been a brutal journey, full of anger and pain, and moments when I wasn't sure if our family would survive intact. But here we were, not perfect, not completely healed, but surviving. More than surviving, in a way, growing through the pain. I had learned things about myself in those months, things not always pleasant. He had learned that I was capable of cruelty when hurt, capable of calculated revenge, capable of holding a grudge for much longer than was healthy. But she had also learned that she was capable of forgiveness, eventually, reluctantly, capable of seeing beyond the betrayal to the broken person who committed it. Capable of giving chances, even when they weren't deserved, because sometimes people needed chances they didn't deserve to become people who deserved them. Jennifer once told me that the measure of a man wasn't whether he never made mistakes, but how he dealt with mistakes when they happened. By the same logic, perhaps the measure of a family wasn't whether it never had conflicts or betrayals, but how it dealt with those betrayals when they inevitably happened. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Carter family was dealing with it in the best way possible, given the impossible circumstances. The next day, Sunday, I woke up with a determination that had been brewing in the back of my mind for weeks. It was time to have one last conversation with Marcus, not about what he had done, but about where we were going from here. I called him and asked to meet that afternoon at Waterfront Park, a place where we used to play frisbee as teenagers. Marcus agreed, and at 3 o'clock we were sitting on a bench overlooking the Willamette River, watching kayakers and paddleboarders enjoying one of the last beautiful days before autumn arrived in full force. I began by saying that I had thought a lot about everything that had happened and that I had come to some conclusions. He told Marcus that he was ready to officially forgive him. Not forget, he would never forget, but forgive. He said that Marcus had shown over the past few months that he was capable of real change, that he was serious about his commitment to becoming a better person, and that holding on to the anger was only hurting him at that point. It wasn't serving any productive purpose. Marcus started to cry. He didn't try to hide or hold back. He just let the tears fall as he looked at the river. She said she didn't know what to say, that she had waited for those words for so long, that now that she heard them, she couldn't fully process them. I said that he didn't need to say anything. He just needed to keep doing the work, continue with the therapy, continue being the better version of himself that he was striving to become. But then I said something else. Something I'd been thinking about since my conversation with Emma weeks ago. I said that forgiveness didn't mean everything would go back to the way it was before, that there would still be limits, there would still be consequences, we would still need time to fully rebuild trust. I said that Marcus wouldn't automatically be included in all familiar things anymore, that he would need to gradually earn his way back. That if he wanted Emma and Noah to spend time with him alone, unsupervised, it would take time. That if he wanted to be a confidant again, someone I shared personal details of my life with, it would take even more time. Marcus nodded, said he understood, that he didn't expect instant access back to everything he'd lost. He said he was prepared to spend as much time as necessary, proving he deserved that trust. We sat on that bench for over an hour, talking about things we hadn't talked about in years, about our childhood memories, about our father, and how his death had affected each of us in different ways, about relationships, about work, about dreams we'd had when we were young, and how life had taken unexpected turns. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was talking to my brother, not someone I was punishing or supervising, but an equal, someone flawed and human, just like me. When we finally got up to leave, Marcus asked me if I wanted to play basketball sometime, like we used to. I said yes, that we could do that, and in that simple agreement there was a promise. The promise that we would find our way back to each other, slowly and carefully, but that we would get there eventually. October arrived, bringing with it Portland's typical rains and a palpable change in the air. Leaves began to fall from the trees, creating carpets of orange and yellow on the sidewalks, and there was that sense of closure that autumn always brings, as if nature were preparing for a new beginning after winter. Marcus had faithfully continued with his therapy, now entering his 7th month of weekly sessions with Dr. Chen. He had also enrolled in a graphic design certification program at Portland Community College, with evening classes twice a week. He said that for the first time in years, he had a direction, a tangible goal to work towards. And most importantly, he said he was finally beginning to like the person he saw in the mirror every morning. Our family had established a new routine. Marcus came over for dinner every Tuesday, as had become tradition, but now he also sometimes showed up on Sundays to watch Seahawks games with me, something we hadn't done since before our father died. Emma had completely reverted to treating him like the uncle she'd always known, sharing stories from school, asking for advice about boys, things teenagers do with adults they trust. Noah was simply happy to have someone who would play video games with him for hours without complaining. And Jennifer, ever the careful observer, commented several times on how genuinely different Marcus seemed, not just in his actions, but in his energy, in how he occupied space in the world. There was a solidity about him now that hadn't existed before, a confidence born not of arrogance but of hard-won self-knowledge. But not everything was perfect. There were still difficult moments, moments when old wounds unexpectedly reopened. Like when we received an invitation in the mail for a distant cousin's wedding, and Jennifer's first reaction was to ask if Marcus should be invited or if his presence would create unnecessary drama in the extended family. Or when Emma casually mentioned that one of her friends had asked about Uncle Marcus, clearly having heard gossip, and Emma didn't know how to respond. Or when I woke up in the middle of the night with that familiar tightness in my chest, remembering those early days of discovery when my world had been turned upside down. In those moments, I had to consciously remember to breathe, to focus on the progress we had made, to not let the past hijack the present. In mid-October, my mother called me with a request. She wanted to have a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, with the whole family gathered for the first time since everything exploded. She said she was getting old, that she didn't know how many more Thanksgivings she would have, and that she wanted to see her children, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren together around a table sharing a meal. Her emotional appeal was transparent, but also genuine. I talked to Jennifer about it, and she left the decision to me. She said she would support whatever choice I made, but reminded me that forgiveness was a process and that sometimes you had to take steps before you were completely ready, trusting that you would be ready when you got there. I thought about it for a few days, weighing the pros and cons, imagining what it would be like to have everyone together again. Finally, I agreed. I told my mother we would have Thanksgiving together, but there was one condition. I wanted it to be just immediate family, no aunts, uncles or cousins, or added drama. Just us, focusing on rebuilding our core group before expanding to wider circles. My mother enthusiastically agreed, and I could hear the relief and joy in her voice. She immediately started planning the menu, calling the next day to ask if Emma still liked pumpkin pie with marshmallows on top, and if Noah preferred creamy or chunky mashed potatoes. Those little details, that attention to individual preferences, were so characteristic of my mother that it made me smile, despite my apprehension about the whole event. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were surprisingly normal. I worked on new projects at the office, including an ambitious pedestrian bridge being proposed to connect two parks in Beaverton. Emma was busy with volleyball season, having made the junior high school team. Noah was obsessed with a new Minecraft game and constantly tried to teach me about redstone and automated farms, things I pretended to understand so as not to disappoint him. Jennifer had taken on a major case at work, a complicated corporate merger that required long hours, but which she found intellectually stimulating. And Marcus kept showing up, reliable as clockwork, every Tuesday and Sunday, weaving himself back into the fabric of our daily lives. There was one particular moment, a few weeks before Thanksgiving, that stood out. It was a rainy Sunday, and Marcus had come over to watch the Seahawks play the 49ers. During halftime, while Jennifer and the kids were in the kitchen making nachos, Marcus and I were alone in the living room. He turned to me and said something he'd clearly been wanting to say for a while. He said he understood now, after months of therapy and self-reflection, that what he'd done wasn't really about me. It was about him, about his own sense of inadequacy, his inability to build a life that made him happy. He said he'd spent so much time blaming me, blaming our parents, blaming circumstances, when the reality was that he was solely responsible for his own choices and the person he had become. That admission, delivered without drama or requests for validation, just a factual statement of hard-won understanding, was one of the most significant moments of our entire journey. Because it proved that Marcus wasn't just going through the motions of recovery, wasn't just doing what therapists and family expected. He was truly, fundamentally changing how he thought about himself and the world. I told him I appreciated that I recognized the work he had done to reach that point of self-awareness. And then, for the first time in months, I said the words I had been avoiding. I said I was proud of him, proud of the man he was becoming, even if the path to get there had been tortuous and painful. Thanksgiving arrived on a cloudy but rain-free Thursday, a small mercy considering how unpredictable the weather in Portland could be in November. We arrived at my mother's house around noon, laden with desserts Jennifer had made and a plate of scalloped potatoes that was my specialty. Marcus was already there, helping our mother in the kitchen, wearing a ridiculous apron with a cartoon turkey on it. When we walked in, he looked up and smiled, but there was nervousness there too. We all knew that this dinner was a test, an important milestone in our collective recovery. If we could spend a few hours together as a family, sharing a traditional meal without drama or unbearable tension, it would be a sign that we had truly turned a corner. Dinner was surprisingly wonderful. Our mother had outdone herself preparing a perfectly golden turkey, melt-in-your-mouth stuffing, a thick, flavorful gravy, and all the traditional sides we remembered from childhood. We sat around the dining table, which wasn't really big enough for 7 people, but somehow we made it work, elbows bumping, plates being passed around. Before we started eating, my mother insisted we all share something we were grateful for. Emma said she was grateful for the volleyball team and the new friends she'd made. Noah said he was grateful for Minecraft and pizza. Jennifer said she was grateful for family, even when things got tough. Marcus hesitated, then said he was grateful for second chances and for a family that hadn't given up on him, even when it would have been easier to do so. When my turn came, I looked around the table at each face, each person I loved in different ways. My mother, aging but still strong, still the heart of the family. Jennifer, my partner in everything, the person who kept me grounded, even when I wanted to drift into anger and resentment. Emma and Noah growing up so fast, learning lessons about forgiveness and human complexity that they would carry into their adult lives. And Marcus, my brother, flawed and human, but truly trying to be better. I said I was grateful for everyone at that table, for their patience with me as I processed my own anger and pain, and for their willingness to do the hard work of healing, even when it would have been easier to simply walk away. And I realized, saying those words, that I truly meant them, that I wasn't just being polite or going through the motions. I was genuinely grateful. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of food, conversation, and laughter. We played board games after dinner, Pictionary and charades, with mixed teams and friendly competition. Marcus and Emma turned out to be exceptional partners in Pictionary, their minds working in sync in ways that made the rest of us laugh in frustration. Noah fell asleep on the couch around 8, his belly full of turkey and pie, and Jennifer gently tucked him under a blanket instead of waking him for the car ride home. Around 9, Emma was also struggling to keep her eyes open, so we decided it was time to go. We said goodbye, hugs longer and tighter than usual, all of us feeling the significance of what we had accomplished that night. In the parking lot, before getting into the car, Marcus called me over. I walked over to where he was standing next to the Honda Civic, his hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cold night air. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with an expression that was part gratitude, part sadness, part hope. Then he said he wanted me to know something. He said he would never forget what he had done, that he would carry it with him for the rest of his life, but that he would also never forget that I had given him a chance to do better, to be better. He said he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that chance, not just for me, but for the whole family, for himself. I nodded, not trusting my voice to crack, and we extended our hands in a handshake that turned into a quick hug. As we drove home that night, Emma and Noah asleep in the back seat, Jennifer took my hand and squeezed it. She asked how I was feeling. I thought about it for a moment, trying to articulate the complex mix of emotions. I said I felt hopeful for the first time in a long time. Not that everything was perfect or completely resolved, but that I finally felt we were heading in the right direction, that Marcus was truly changing, that our family was healing, that maybe we could find a path to something resembling normalcy again. Jennifer smiled and said she had seen that too, that she had observed how Marcus interacted with the children, how he talked about his work and therapy, and that she truly believed he was committed to long-term change. But Jennifer also reminded me of something important. She said that healing wasn't linear, that there would be setbacks and difficult days, and that I needed to be prepared for that. That Marcus was human and would make mistakes, not the same catastrophic mistakes, hopefully, but mistakes nonetheless. And that when that happened, I would need to decide how to respond, whether with the anger of the early days or with the complicated compassion that had begun to develop. I said I hoped to choose compassion, but that I was honest enough with myself to know it wouldn't always be easy. That there were scars that would probably never completely disappear, moments of mistrust that would arise without warning, but that I was committed to trying, to giving Marcus and myself the best possible chance to recover what we had lost. The months following Thanksgiving brought continuous and gradual changes. Marcus managed to finish his first semester in the graphic design program with excellent grades and landed his first real paying client, a small local business that needed a logo redesign. He was so proud that he called to tell me immediately, his voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in years. I genuinely congratulated him, told him I knew he had talent and that he just needed the right structure and motivation to apply it. Marcus also finally moved out of our mother's basement into a small studio apartment in Gresham. It wasn't much, but it was his, paid for with his own money, a symbol of independence he hadn't had in years. Jennifer and I decided to invest in another property to renovate, having enjoyed not only the financial return, but also the process of transforming something broken into something new. This time, Marcus offered to help not as an obligation, but as a genuine partner, bringing his design skills to assist with aesthetic choices and layout. We worked together some Saturdays, not every Saturday as before, but enough to maintain the connection. And I discovered that I now truly enjoyed that time together, no longer seeing it as punishment or obligation, but as collaboration between siblings who were learning to know each other again, as equal adults instead of dysfunctional childhood dynamics. Emma earned a starting spot on the volleyball team in the second semester, and Marcus never missed one of their home games. He would sit in the stands, sometimes alone, sometimes with us, cheering enthusiastically and filming videos on his phone that he would later send to Emma with encouraging comments. Noah started asking to spend time with Uncle Marcus alone, and after much discussion, Jennifer and I agreed to let them spend a few hours together on Saturdays, usually playing basketball in the park or going to the arcade. These small steps of trust were terrifying for me at first, but as nothing bad happened and Marcus continued to prove his reliability, I became more comfortable. In early March, almost a year after it all began, Marcus asked me for coffee. He said he had something important to discuss. We met at the same Starbucks where everything had started to change months before. Marcus seemed nervous but determined, stirring his coffee before finally speaking. He said that Dr. Chen felt he had reached a point where he no longer needed weekly therapy and that he could reduce it to monthly maintenance sessions. He said this was scary because therapy had become an important anchor in his life, but it was also exciting because it represented real progress. Then Marcus said something that took me by surprise. He said he wanted to start speaking publicly about his experience, perhaps giving talks at schools or community groups about the dangers of identity theft, cyberbullying, and the consequences of impulsive actions born of envy and insecurity. The idea was both courageous and terrifying. It would mean Marcus would have to publicly relive the worst moment of his life repeatedly, exposing his deepest vulnerabilities to strangers. But it would also mean that perhaps he could help other people, perhaps prevent young people from making similar mistakes, perhaps give hope to people struggling with their own demons that real change was possible. I asked Marcus if he had really thought about it, about the implications. He said yes, that he had discussed it extensively with Dr. Chen, and that he felt it was something he needed to do, not just for others but for himself, as a way to transform his darkest mistake into something with the potential to help, to find meaning and purpose in suffering. I told Marcus that I would support whatever decision he made, but that he needed to be prepared for the fact that some people would never forgive him, that there would always be those who saw him only through the lens of his worst mistake. Marcus nodded and said he understood, but that he couldn't let the fear of others' judgment stop him from trying to do something good. And in that moment, looking at my brother speaking with such clarity and purpose about transforming trauma into meaningful action, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I felt genuine admiration, not for what he had done, never for that, but for the person he had become through the brutal process of confronting his actions and rebuilding himself from scratch. It was a complicated admiration, tempered by the memory of the pain he had caused, but it was real nonetheless. And now, sitting here more than a year after that terrible day when I discovered the fake profiles, writing all this, trying to make sense of a story without clean endings or perfect resolutions, I realized something important. My revenge against Marcus worked, but not in the way I originally intended. It didn't permanently destroy him or make him pay through endless suffering. Instead, it forced us both to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our family, about how unhealed pain can manifest in destructive behaviors. My revenge transformed into something different along the way, something more like enforced accountability and eventual reluctant reconciliation. And perhaps that's better than any traditional revenge would have been. Marcus still carries scars from what he did, and I still carry scars from what was done to me. Our relationship will never be exactly what it was before, because you can't undo knowledge. You can't deny that someone was capable of betraying you so deeply. But perhaps we could build something new, something based not on naive trust, but on hard-won understanding, not on unrealistic expectations, but on recognition of flawed humanity. Jennifer was right from the beginning. Revenge and justice were different things, and what we eventually found was somewhere in between. A complicated and messy way to move forward that was imperfectly satisfying, but was real and human and honest. And in the end, maybe that's the best either of us could hope for. If you're listening to this story and find yourself in a similar situation, betrayed by someone close, consumed by justifiable anger, wanting to make the other person pay, I understand. I've been there. I've felt each of those emotions, acted on some of them, and regretted parts of it. My advice, for what it's worth, is this. Seek justice if you need to, set boundaries that protect you and your family, demand real accountability and not just empty apologies. But also be open to the possibility, no matter how small, that people can genuinely change if forced to confront their actions and do the hard work of transformation. Don't forgive too soon or too easily, but also don't hold on to anger forever, because in the end, holding on to anger is like drinking poison, hoping the other person will die. You're the one who suffers the most. My brother tried to ruin my marriage out of envy and inadequacy. My revenge left him in tears, forced him to confront his deepest demons, nearly destroyed what remained of his sense of self. But it also led him to therapy, to real self-awareness, to a chance to become a genuinely better person. And my revenge changed me too, forced me to confront my own capacity for cruelty, my need for control, my fear of failure or of being seen as less than perfect. In the end, perhaps we both needed to go through that fire to burn away the worst of ourselves and find something more genuine underneath. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't what I planned when it all began. But it was real, and sometimes real is the best we can get.